Anyhow, good afternoon to you. Welcome. In 1923, Eamon de Valera, who was born in the United States, who became President of Ireland, was a revolutionary figure, came back to County Clare after spending an extended holiday in the United States. And the reason he was in the United States was that in 1919, when he was making a political speech in Ennis, the British Army, and the Black and Tans especially, arrived in the town and decided to arrest this political radical. And they marched him off to Lincoln Jail in England. And he escaped from Lincoln Jail and came to America, where he spent most of the Irish War of Independence. And he came back to Ennis, to precisely the same place where he was arrested 4 years earlier. And his opening remarks were, as I was saying before I was so rudely interrupted. So, as I was saying before I was so rudely interrupted, it's nice to be back in the Catskills despite the vagrancies of the scientific revolution. My topic today is women in Irish traditional music, and you may well be asking yourselves, why is a man doing this topic? And let me rationalise, particularly in respect to the male figure in the equation. My own music making was inherited from 5 generations of female musicians before me, all concertina players, all from the area of Kilmaley in Lisrow in the Mount Callan district of County Clare. And my tradition was inherited from the female line, my grandmother being a concertina player, and the concertina being particularly identified with women in County Clare. In Gaelic it was known as bancordian, a woman's accordion. It wasn't a generic Gaelic word for concertina. And certainly it became a popular instrument among women in the latter stages of the 19th century, precisely because 1 generation after the Great Famine, women again had disposable income, particularly as a result of the Congested Districts Board and the work of the co-op movement in the western parts of rural Ireland, whereby women were again producing on small farms and creating small incomes for themselves, particularly from the sale of butter and eggs. Butter was generally shipped to the main centres of distribution in Cork and Limerick, and it was considered a major source of independent income for both married and single women in rural communities in the later stages of the 19th century. Hence, as a result of this extra disposable income, they went and bought concertinas in the Midwest of Ireland along the Shannon Basin, and hence the identification of women and concertina music. It's interesting that Limerick was the last port of call for toll ships crossing the North Atlantic to fish off the Grand Banks in Newfoundland. And to navigate the River Shannon from the Atlantic Ocean to Limerick was quite an ordeal, and it required taking on board a river pilot off the southwest Clare coast, who navigated the ship up the River Shannon. The 60-mile narrow channels were treacherous, and in the exchange between river pilots and Atlantic sailing ships, commodities like 8-day clocks and concertinas and instruments and tobacco and alcohol became standard fare, so that many of the rural communities on both sides of the River Shannon in County Kerry and in West Limerick and in southwest Clare became recipients of, if you like, technology long before many of the other rural parts of Ireland as a result of maritime contact. And that too encouraged the incorporation of concertinas into the music of Clare, Kerry and West Limerick. And I think before dealing with the whole process of women in Irish music, I think we need to consider the role of women in Irish society, which of course is a whole course in itself, and I will keep my remarks short and cursory, but I think we need to realise that Ireland, like most other Western European countries, is the recipient of patriarchal history. Irish history is predominantly written by males, for males, about males. And certainly when we consider the whole corpus of Irish proto-history, prehistory, early Irish history, medieval history, and indeed modern Irish history, we have, like most other European historical models, we have history which is predominantly patriarchal. The early Irish sources and the early Irish mythology. And the corpus of early Irish mythology talks about great kings, great war heroes, great monks, great druids, great political figures, but very few women. Now there are exceptions. Maeve, Queen of Connaught, was an exception from the northern part of Connaught. She's buried in County Sligo. She was quite an exception in what was, for all intents and purposes, a Celtic patriarchal society. We have other exceptions in later medieval times, particularly during the reign of Elizabeth. The warrior queen Grace O'Malley from County Mayo was quite a formidable figure during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I of England. And at one point in her life she had an altercation with the High Sheriff of Connaught, and she decided instead of dealing with the problem in Ireland, she would bring her case to London. So she got in her fleet, sailed around the southwest coast of Ireland, crossed the south of England and up the River Thames, and straight to court to Queen Elizabeth I. And we know that Edmund Spencer was in court when Queen Grace O'Malley arrived to meet Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth I. And he gives us a detailed account of that visit and that meeting between the two queens. And the only common language that these two women had in common was Latin. Queen Elizabeth I didn't speak Gaelic, much to her loss, and Queen Grace O'Malley didn't speak English, and the only common vernacular they had was Latin, which Grace O'Malley had learned from the monks at the monastery of Cong. And Spencer is very explicit in his remarks. He says, the Latin of the Irish Queen was far superior to that of Her Majesty. So these were quite formidable women about whom we get glimpses, very, very superficial gleanings from Irish history, from the pre-Christian period down until very recent times. In terms of what the sources tell us, we know a tremendous amount from the law tracts. There were three largely autonomous legal systems governing life and society and politics in Irish history from the early Christian period down until quite recent times. The earliest law code was the Brehon Law Code, which was largely customary law administered by Brehons. And these law tracts deal specifically with the status of women, who were far more egalitarian in their treatment of women than British or English common law, or indeed law in Ireland until very recent times, until we became part of the European community. The early Irish laws are very explicit in terms of the different kinds of marriages that were available to women. They're very explicit on the laws of divorce. We had divorce in Ireland down until the 14th century. They're very explicit in terms of the role of women and the role of children and the protection of children within society. Ironically, when canon law was introduced, we find that the autonomy and the accessibility of law in terms of the status of women becomes narrow. Certainly, canon law is, again, a process that reinforces patriarchal male society within an ecclesiastical environment. English common law arrived in Ireland in the certainly the 12th century, when the Norman settlement spread across the Midlands and into the lowlands of Ulster, and that too was another law code which regulated and directed the lives of women. Now, the common theme through these three law codes concerned women and property. For the most part, women in early Christian Ireland from the 4th century down until the 14th century could not inherit property. This was one of the distinguishing features that divided women from men. Under very, very exceptional circumstances, could widows inherit property which invariably transferred to their sons on her death and back into the male lineage within a family environment. Now, it's interesting that when the Industrial Revolution was introduced to Ireland, particularly the northeastern part of the island in the 17th century, women and children became extremely fundamental to the success of the linen industry and the cotton industry, particularly in the area around Belfast. And in fact, the earliest rudiments or the earliest elements of the linen industry was located within cottage industrial environments where individual women and their children were incorporated into an extensive network of cottage industries which fed into the factory model in places like Belfast and later on in the south of Ireland. If you're familiar with the works of Maria Edgeworth, for example, she describes in detail the managerial roles of women in Anglo-Irish society, particularly in ascendancy society. Moving closer to our own times, we know that the Great Famine was catastrophic in terms of the role of Irish women. After the Great Famine, women became the dispossessed sex, or the disinherited sex in Irish society. Prior to the famine, we had a population certainly in excess of 8 million people. We know that in the decade of the 1840s, 1 million people died of starvation, right next door to the leading industrial power of the day. 1 million people immigrated, and in the radical transformation of Irish society that came as a result of the Great Famine, women lost a tremendous amount of autonomy, both as economic as well as social agents within Irish society. We know, for example, that the whole process of farming and land use changed as a result of the famine experience. Irish society was extremely labour intensive before the famine. You needed manpower. Give you a case in point, a small 40-acre farm could not be run efficiently without at least the 6 children to provide for the various manpower requirements. And certainly in an environment which was predominantly agrarian, women and children did most of the donkey work in terms of sowing, ploughing, tilling, picking stones, picking potatoes, sowing potatoes, taking care of animals, processing the various animal produce, and providing firewood and particularly turf. All of it extremely backbreaking, labour-intensive work. Now with the change in Irish farming, with the shift from tillage to pasture, the shift from tillage farming to cattle raising and sheep raising, equivalent perhaps to the clearance of people from the Highlands of Scotland and the replacement of people by sheep, Ireland underwent a similar economic and social transformation after the Great Famine. Hence women were deprived of all of these various employment and economic opportunities that they had prior to the famine experience. We also know that in the Ireland of the post-famine period, we had a number of liturgical revolutions. And these liturgical revolutions radically changed the role of Irish women, particularly the synods which met in 1850 and in 1870. And there is a preoccupation with morality in post-famine Ireland. And for morality, you should read explicitly and specifically sexual morality. In other words, the morality of sin and the sins of the flesh in particular. So there's a rampant codification of behaviour which comes out of the liturgical revolution throughout the latter part of the 19th century, in which the roles of women were further narrowed, confined to the home. The confessional became the source of psychological as well as social and moral policing. And certainly that had a tremendous impact on the roles of women in Irish society. Now that began to change ever so slightly towards the end of the 19th century, when Irish women, particularly upper middle class bourgeois and ascendancy women, were, to all intents and purposes, influenced by the first women's movement, particularly the suffragette movement in the United Kingdom and the women's movement in the United States, particularly the campaign to have women vote, suffrage. And we find that throughout the later years, the later decades of the 19th century, women in Ireland are very, very active in the Land League, the campaign to transfer ownership from landlords to tenants. And we also find that women in 19th century Ireland were very active in the Home Rule movement. In other words, the earliest attempts to separate Ireland politically from Great Britain. We find that figures like Fanny Parnell, sister of Charles Stuart Parnell, are very active in terms of creating a forum for women to contribute to the politicisation of Irish society. And indeed, in the decade prior to the 1916 Rising, women played a major role in the Republican movement, the movement which eventually would lead to a Gaelic Renaissance the revival movement, the literary movement, and eventually the rising of 1916, the War of Independence, and the subsequent separation of Free State Ireland from Great Britain. And it's interesting that when you consider the contribution of these Irish women to Irish politics, in fact, Ireland was the first country in Europe to produce a female minister. In 1919, Countess Markievicz was the first woman in Europe to be a government minister. She was Minister for Labour in the first Irish independent parliament of 1919, way before most of the other European countries allowed women such access to politics and to high positions. Now, ironically, in the 1920s and 1930s, as a result of the revolution, as a result of the new state adjusting to its autonomy, we find that all of the achievements of these early women retreat and are undermined, and the role of women again becomes very, very tightly defined socially and culturally. And throughout the 20s and 30s, women are confined to the home, family life. Political access is restricted. Certainly economic status is not at all what it should have, at least was promised to be prior to the revolution. We find, for example, that Irish women are immigrating in large numbers throughout the 20s and the 1930s. By the 1940s, there are more women leaving Ireland to get away from what is, for all intents and purposes, a highly restricted confessional society. The Constitution of 1937 gave a particular mention to the role of the family in Irish society, and it was extremely concerned about the growth of fascism in mainland Europe, and hence the preservation of the family and the vocationalist movement is a driving force which further helped to limit the status and the political access of women. Now, just to give you some statistics, of the 700 odd members of the Irish Parliament, the Irish Congress, since independence, less than 40 have been women. That was the case until the 1990s. Of the juries from various court systems throughout the country, less than 2% were women in the 1920s and 1930s. So there's a tremendous narrowing of the status of women. But of course, all that changed radically in the 1960s and 1970s as a result of the second women's movement. And certainly Ireland really became very vigorously involved in the second women's movement. As a result of the troubles in Northern Ireland, we had political figures like Bernadette Devlin, who was a radical politician. We had a whole corps of journalists writing for the Irish Times, all of them women. People like Maeve Binchy, who many Americans are today familiar with, people like Nuala Fhuilán, people like Nell McCafferty. And into the 1990s, when Ireland produced two female presidents, Mary Robinson, who went on to become a critically important figure in the United Nations, and Mary McAleese, who's the President of Ireland. And certainly the status of women in Ireland has changed radically in the last 10 years, particularly the status of women who are in the public eye, in political office, and in positions of social and cultural power. We know, just to give you another statistic, of the medical doctors that were produced in Ireland from the Irish medical colleges in the last 5 years, 65% of them have been women. That brings us to the topic of today, the role of women in Irish traditional music. Again, a role that hasn't by any manner or means been acknowledged. We have certainly, just to cast our eyes on O'Neill's work, for example, in the early part of the last century. Again, a paucity of female sources and musicians. We talk about iconic figures like Michael Coleman, Paddy Killoran, James Morrison, again, very, very scarce or non-existence of women in the early recording industry. There are exceptions. You think of Kitty O'Neill, for example, and various other minor figures, but certainly they're not given the same prominence as their male counterparts until very, very recent times. Now, the documentary that I want to play for you today was made by a young lady from the University of Portland in Oregon. And she decided that, you know, with myself and a number of other figures, that she was going to research this particular topic. And she went back to Ireland and to Britain and all of the United States and spoke to women musicians. And she started with women who were in their 80s and 70s and 80s, and many of them who have since passed on, and followed the chronology of women music makers, singers and dancers down to very recent times. And in the documentary, which is 28 minutes long, by the way, so you won't miss, despite the late start, too much of your dinners, you will see that chronological change from the 1930s down to the 1990s. And I urge you to be particularly vigilant of the impact of social change in Ireland in the 1930s, particularly the social impact, communal impact, and indeed the moral impact of the Dancehalls Act, which was passed in Ireland in 1935, which, for all intents and purposes, radically changed the nature of rural communities because of a state obsession with the evils that were being imported into Ireland from the United States. Two major evils which arrived in Ireland from the United States: one, the motor car; two, jazz. The motor car dislocated rural communities because it gave an opportunity to young people to travel outside the watchful eyes of their parents and their priests. Jazz, because it was radically new, it was unlegislated for, a little bit like the technological revolution of the 1990s. There was no legislation in place to regulate jazz dancing, and early jazz dancing in Ireland were all-night affairs, and it produced quite a raucous underworld in Dublin. And of course, ironically, during the 1920s, there was a tremendous rise in the number of illegitimate births in Ireland. So clearly the arrival of foreign influences, foreign newspapers, foreign films, foreign books, foreign magazines, foreign fashions, were all collectively blamed for the degeneracy of Irish society in the 1920s and 1930s. And of course, the most visible target within this amorphous change was jazz music. Hence, it became the prime objective of the new legislation in 1935, which tragically was extended to include innocent country house dancing in small rural communities. And the local newspapers throughout the 1930s and the early part of the 1940s are filled with cases before the regional courts, the circuit courts in Ireland, of innocent farmers, male and female, being hauled up before the courts and being penalised, being summoned. And not alone were you brought to court before a justice, but the priest also read out your name from the altar on Sundays. So the whole community knew that you were a sinner. And then, to add insult to injury, you could read about your sins in the local newspaper in explicit detail. So all of this social engineering that became obsessive in Free State Ireland fed directly into the musical and extended cultural behaviour surrounding music making and dancing throughout the 30s and 40s. So it was a very difficult time for what was the first country to break the mould of the British Empire. So when you see these older ladies in this documentary, that is the context of Ireland in the 30s and 40s in which they grew up, and which today is part of an extended European Union, the largest political union in the world, with 500 million consumers. And it might surprise you today to know that we expect that the population of Ireland will double between now and 2020. And it may also surprise you that the second most spoken language in Ireland at the present time is Romanian. We have become European, integrated, cosmopolitan, and certainly the status of women today is radically different from what it was in Ireland 50 years ago, certainly in terms of music, song, and dance. So let's have a look at this. Well, there you have some idea of the work that's taking place, particularly in respect to women in Irish culture and in Irish society, and specifically in relation to the role of women in Irish music. We have only really started to begin the exploration of this topic, which has been tragically neglected, not just in conventional history in Ireland, but in cultural studies. And I think thanks to the wonderful success of women's studies in North American academies. We're feeling the consequences of that now in Ireland. And I think in the coming years, particularly as the universities and the academies in Ireland open up to the whole process of regional studies, and specifically in respect to the role of women in Irish culture, hopefully we will see more of this. I'll be glad to take some questions and observations if any of you have questions. This gentleman here. Yep, I think you understand. The question he's raising is that they seem to have skipped a generation. They went from the very older ladies to the young people. And you're quite right. I should point out that this is one in a series. So it's not quite what I would define as a definitive statement. It's more a statement of work in progress. So hopefully this will be the first of many such detailed studies. And I think one of the interesting things about this particular approach is that it deals with women of the Irish diaspora as well as women in Ireland. And traditionally we've tended to separate one from the other. And here you have an integrated exposure of both extremes. Do we have another question? Yeah, will I talk a little bit about Mrs. Galvin? Yes. Mrs. Galvin was one of the great iconic figures of traditional fiddle music in County Clare. She was, in her maiden name was Nell McCarthy. She was from Kilmahel, which is down on the southwest Eyre Peninsula. And tragically, she lived at a time when electricity and rural electrification hadn't quite extended into the coastal areas of Ireland. But in terms of explaining her music, she would have sounded very similar to the fiddle playing of Bobby Casey and Patrick Kelly. A tendency to use the low tuning. The story about the recording or the non-recording of Mrs. Galvin is very interesting because quite frankly it took the Irish state far too long to realise what a reservoir of culture we had. For example, the Folklore Commission, which began in Ireland prior to the Second World War, focused almost uniquely and explicitly on folklore. And the tragedy is that they dispatched collectors, many of them using just paper and pen, and later on field equipment, but they were specifically or myopically attracted to songs or specific aspects of folklore, and a tremendous amount of instrumental music which they could have easily collected from the same people or the same communities was glossed over. So it wasn't really until Seamus Innes began collecting for the Folklore Commission that we got an insight into the instrumental tradition. The difficulty was, of course, that Innes began collecting during wartime Ireland when it was petrol or gasoline was rationed. So he was travelling by train and by bicycle. He didn't have a recording machine. He simply had his whistle and a notebook to transcribe directly from the sources. And by the time that outside broadcast units with fully comparable field equipment got down to the western parts and the southern parts of Ireland, a lot of these old people had died. It's interesting that even when the Folklore Commission began collecting in the 1940s, they had a schools system whereby they sent out all of the kids in grade school in many rural parishes to speak to their grandparents who had lived during the Great Famine. And the work, the collected work, the notebooks from the kids are today one of the most important oral reservoirs of history concerning the Great Famine. But my point is that by the time the early 1950s rolled around and Radio Éireann sent out collectors from Dublin, when they got to Southwest Clare to record Mrs. Galvin, she had no electricity in the house, so they had no place to hook up their equipment. So basically, when they came back again, she was either too old or they simply missed a golden opportunity. And her story is similar to many, many older musicians in places like West Cork and Kerry and Clare and Galway and Donegal, that had we been on the ball when we became independent, let's say instead of institutionalizing a climate of censorship, or institutionalizing a climate of censorship. Had we gone in the 1920s, and like the Norwegians, or the Danes, or the Swedes, where there was a highly nationalized folklore collection system as early as the 1920s, had we done that in Ireland, I think our reservoir of sources would be far greater than they are today. And that's the story of Mrs. Galvin. There is a number of field recordings that were made very late, but her music would have sounded like Bobby Casey. And according to the people that I've collected from in Clare who knew her, they would consider her almost as wonderful a fiddler as Michael Coleman is to the Sligo people, despite what Seamus Tansey would tell you. The question that was asked, for those of you down in the back who didn't hear the question, was that there was a tremendous emphasis placed on women musicians in London and various parts of England, and not so much in North America, and the female performers within the diaspora in North America. And again, my response is that this is a work in progress, and I urge, particularly those of you who are interested in collecting and who know older women performers, whether they're in families or non-public environments, please take the time to record them, either in audio or video circumstances, because really, I know my own case as a collector, I have lost more people because I hesitated, because I failed to turn up or I failed to make the time. I know in particularly in respect to Clare, which is a huge population in North America, even as far west as San Francisco, we have lost more wonderful performers for the simple reason that people didn't record them. That is a serious issue, but this is a work in progress, and I think in the coming years we'll see an extensive collection in North America as well, both in the United States and in Canada, where there's a wonderful tradition. I should point out that in the United States, I think we have a tendency to only think about the diaspora of Irish people to the US, but I think specifically about communities like the Ottawa Valley community in Canada, where there has been a wonderful preservation of tradition in rural parts of the Ottawa Valley, 2-3 hours north and inland from Ottawa, where even down to the present day, the accents of the people haven't changed. And yet we seem to have lost contact with this part of the diaspora, so that there are many undiscovered rural communities that are carrying on traditions of music and dance, as well as urban communities that are highly visible. The other gentleman at the back had a question as well. The question was that when women immigrated after the Great Famine, did they not have opportunities to become visible as music makers, and did they take advantage of those opportunities? I think we need to distinguish between two waves of immigration. The post-famine immigrant, particularly in terms of the female immigrant, tended to outnumber their male counterparts. They found work as domestic servants predominantly where they lived with families. So their social mobility perhaps wasn't the same as their male counterparts. By the 1930s, the next generation of women immigrants were far more mobile. I think particularly about people like Lucy Farr that you saw in this documentary. They're not living in confined environments. They're not domestic servants. They're women who are educated, who have a greater access to education, and their sense of social and cultural mobility is far more defined and far wide-ranging than their predecessors during famine times. I think we need to distinguish as well with famine immigrants, there's a tremendous amount of chain migration. In other words, if a woman immigrated and found work as a domestic servant, it was expected that she would in turn send money back to Ireland to send out the next member of the family, so that you had you were constantly embroiled in a chain network where you were either sending remittances back to Ireland to support your family or providing fares to ship the next member of the family out. Because remember, we're talking specifically about an Ireland where women didn't inherit property, and unless they had a sufficiently attractive dowry, they didn't marry well. So we had, let's say, in most families, 80% of the siblings were exiles. And that was certainly the case in Ireland down until the 1960s, where the the exile was the norm, the immigrant was the norm, the exception was the person who actually stayed at home on the land or living close to the family environment. So I think we need to distinguish between the two different strains of immigrants, because certainly in the second strain, these women become more visible as music makers. If you're interested in the history of Irish traditional music, I do have a topic history which covers Irish music from the Celts to river dance, without footnotes or examinations. I also have a recording which features 7 well-known traditional musicians, all female, which are available here. And I should also remind you that tomorrow and for the rest of the week we also have some wonderful lectures coming down the pike. Hopefully the technology, now that it's set up, will be ready and on time, so to speak. But we have a lecture on the music of Gearóid, we have a lecture on Irish music in Chicago and Irish music in County Leitrim, and these are all important components in the vast, rich tapestry of Irish traditional music. And I think that a week such as we have here in the Catskills has created a wonderful forum beyond the strict structures of academia and beyond the strict structures of competition, which in their own way are terribly delineating and terribly myopic. So I urge all of you to enjoy the freedom and the association with particularly the older performers who are here with us from Ireland and from various parts of the United States. And I thank all of you for being here this afternoon.